For the first time since both companies were founded more than 100 years ago, both Canadian Pacific and Canadian National Railways are not running. The two companies unable to come to a deal with more than 9,000 workers.
The Canadian government ordered workers and the two railroad companies to go into arbitration and get back to work after a rail stoppage that started at midnight.
Breaking news. Minutes ago, a decision made far from Washington quietly rewrote the balance of power in North American trade. There was no emergency meeting, no tariff announcement, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, Canada activated an alternative that had existed on maps for a century but never truly functioned. And in doing so, it turned a long-standing American advantage into an option rather than a necessity. The United States did not lose access overnight. What it lost was something far more consequential: exclusivity. For more than 100 years, Western Canada's path to global markets followed a single logic. If Canadian grain, minerals, or bulk commodities were going anywhere at scale, they went south first. American rail networks, American ports, American logistics firms handled the transfers. Even cargo bound for Europe often crossed the U.S. border because that was where the infrastructure worked reliably. Geography did not require this. Infrastructure enforced it. And over time, that enforcement became invisible, accepted as normal. That arrangement created leverage without ever needing to be declared. When access to markets flows through someone else's system, influence comes built in. Fees are charged. Schedules are set. Capacity is allocated. Disputes are resolved on terms defined by the owner of the network. Canada lived with that reality because the alternative, a northern rail line running through permafrost to an Arctic port, was chronically underfunded and commercially fragile. The Hudson Bay Railway existed, but it did not compete. And because it did not compete, it did not matter. What changed was not the railway itself, but the strategic environment around it. As trade tensions intensified and political pressure from Washington became more explicit, Ottawa's tolerance for structural dependence declined. The issue was no longer efficiency alone. It was risk. If Canadian exporters had no viable alternative to American routes, then any disruption, political or economic, carried asymmetric consequences. Optionality became the objective. In late 2025, Canada committed more than $260 million to upgrading the Hudson Bay Railway and reinforcing port infrastructure at Churchill. On the surface, it looked like a regional investment, the kind of announcement that rarely travels beyond domestic news. In reality, it was the activation of a dormant corridor that removes a bottleneck most analysts had stopped thinking about. The decision did not threaten U.S. ports. It bypassed them. For decades, the Hudson Bay route failed because it could not offer reliability at scale. The terrain was unforgiving. Seasonal flooding and ground movement damaged track. The shipping season was short. Freight volumes were inconsistent. In an era when southern routes worked smoothly, the northern option was marginal. That assessment no longer holds. Advances in monitoring, maintenance, and ice support have altered the economics. Longer ice-free periods in Hudson Bay have extended the shipping window, and modern rail standards have transformed what the line can carry. This matters because trade power is not measured in single shipments. It is measured in patterns. When exporters begin routing even a fraction of their volume through a new corridor, that corridor gains credibility. Insurers adjust. Shipping companies commit capacity. Storage and handling facilities expand. The route stops being experimental and starts being assumed. Once that happens, the old dependency does not return by default. From the perspective of American ports and logistics firms, the change is subtle but corrosive. No single customer disappears overnight. Instead, volumes diversify. Margins compress. Negotiating power weakens. When Canadian exporters can credibly say they have another way to reach Europe without crossing the U.S. border, the leverage embedded in American infrastructure declines. It does not vanish, but it becomes conditional. The most important shift is psychological as much as economic. For generations, routing through the United States was treated as unavoidable. That assumption shaped investment, contracts, and policy choices. By making an alternative operational, Canada has punctured that assumption. And assumptions, once broken, rarely reassemble. Consider what moves along this corridor. Prairie grain bound for European markets travels a shorter distance north than it does south. Bulk fertilizer and potash, produced in enormous volumes, no longer require American transshipment to reach overseas buyers. Critical minerals, increasingly central to industrial and defense supply chains, can be exported directly rather than routed through U.S. processing hubs by default. Each of these shifts is incremental. Together, they reallocate influence. This is why the move is structural rather than tactical. It does not depend on the personality of any leader in Washington or Ottawa. It does not require retaliation or negotiation. Once infrastructure exists and proves reliable, market behavior follows. Companies make decisions based on cost, time, and risk. Politics enters only indirectly, through stability and predictability. From Washington's standpoint, the miscalculation was not aggressive intent, but complacency. American policymakers had grown accustomed to a system in which trade dependence worked quietly in their favor. There was little incentive to defend that advantage explicitly because it seemed permanent. Infrastructure outside U.S. control, especially in the Arctic, was not viewed as a near-term competitor. That underestimation is now visible. The Hudson Bay Railway's revival does not eliminate southern routes. Vancouver remains vital for Pacific trade. American ports will continue to handle significant Canadian volumes. But what has changed is the absence of compulsion. When exporters have a choice, influence must be earned rather than assumed. Discounts matter. Service quality matters. Political pressure matters less. This is also why the shift cannot be easily reversed. Even if bilateral relations improve dramatically, Canada has no incentive to dismantle a corridor that provides leverage through independence. Once exporters integrate the northern route into their logistics planning, abandoning it would reintroduce vulnerability. Path dependence sets in. Infrastructure creates habits, and habits shape power. Other countries are paying attention. Middle powers with similar dependencies are watching how quietly the balance changed. No confrontation was required. No alliance was broken. Canada did not challenge American authority directly. It simply invested in its own capacity and allowed market logic to do the rest. That model is replicable, and that is what makes it strategically significant.